The fluorescent lights hum against white tile as Laura Bennett moves through the cardiac unit at Oak Creek Memorial with the kind of invisibility only 15 years of practice can buy. She doesn't announce herself. She doesn't make eye contact. She simply appears at the bedside, checks the monitor, adjusts the flow, and disappears into the next room like she was never there at all. The hallway stretches before her, antiseptic and cold, the smell of bleach mixing with something underneath it, something like copper and resignation. Her scrubs are faded, the blue worn almost grey at the elbows. Her greying hair is pulled back so tight it pulls the skin at her temples. She moves like water through a system designed to ignore her. Room 504. Post-op Marine General Marcus Hayes had arrived 3 hours ago, his chest still wrapped tight, his monitors already settling into the rhythm of recovery. Laura pushes the door open without knocking, a nurse doesn't announce herself to a sleeping patient, and steps inside. The room is dim except for the green glow of the cardiac monitor, the soft beep-beep-beep of a heart that's learned how to beat again after the surgeons put it back together. His family had filled the waiting room chairs outside, she'd seen them when she walked past. 2 daughters in their 30s, a wife with her hand pressed against her mouth like she was holding something in. Now there was only the general, breathing shallow under the oxygen mask, his left arm bandaged where the central line had gone in. Laura checks the arterial line first, the needle that goes into the wrist, reading pressure like a constant conversation with the body. She knows how to listen to what a body is trying to tell her. 92/60. Good. She adjusts the drip by 0.2 milliliters, a movement so small most people wouldn't see it happen. Her hands move with the precision of someone who has done this exact motion 10,000 times. Muscle memory, but deeper than that. Training that lives in the hands themselves, in the spaces between the bones and tendons, in the kind of knowledge that doesn't need to be remembered because it was never allowed to be forgotten. She studies his face while she works. Not looking at him the way a typical nurse looks at a patient, assessing comfort, monitoring for pain. She studies him like she's reading a map. Like his face is telling her something about what happened, what could happen, what needs to happen next. His forehead is broad. His jaw squared. His chest rises and falls beneath the monitors and the bandages. There's something in the set of his shoulders, even at rest, that speaks of command. Of authority held so long it became biology. Laura's hands pause for just a fraction of a second, that's all it takes, and then she moves on to the next monitor. She has work to do. 15 years of work. 15 years of moving through hospitals in San Diego as if she was part of the furniture. As if she was nothing. She finishes her assessment and exits room 504 without writing notes, without drawing attention. The hallway stretches on. Morning rounds haven't started yet. She has maybe 30 minutes before Dr. Sterling arrives with his entourage of residents and the whole machine of hierarchy that runs on protocol and fear. 30 minutes to herself. She heads toward the break room, her shoes clicking against the tile in a rhythm that matches the ventilators humming behind closed doors. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. The same rhythm she learned once in another lifetime, in another place where footsteps mattered. Her locker is at the back of the break room, tucked in a corner where the fluorescent lights buzz and flicker with a rhythm that's almost hypnotic. She opens it and looks down. On the top shelf, a lunch container and 3 bottles of water. On the middle shelf, extra scrubs folded into rectangles. And at the bottom, wrapped in layers, something she hasn't touched in 15 years. Black garbage bags, one inside another, sealed like a tomb. Inside them, combat boots. Worn. Scarred. The kind of boots that have stood in places where the ground turned to dust and the sky turned red with sunset and something else. Something that doesn't have a name until you've seen it. Laura reaches down and touches the garbage bag with one finger. Just one. The plastic is cool. Her hand trembles for exactly half a second, then stops. She closes the locker door. Her phone buzzes. A text from Maya, her daughter, 16 years old and typing with the fury of someone who thinks her mother is always at work. Working late again. 3 words that contain a year of resignation. Laura pulls up the keyboard, and her thumbs move across the screen. Always. One word back. Always. That's what she's built. That's what she lives. Always at work. Always invisible. Always moving through these hallways like she was made of the same material as the tile and the walls and the fluorescent lights that hum overhead. She puts the phone away and sits down at one of the break room tables with her lunch. A sandwich. An apple. A container of yogurt. The food of someone trying to disappear. She's alone. She's been eating lunch alone for approximately 4 months, ever since Dr. Sterling arrived and established his dominion over the cardiac unit the way territorial animals establish dominion, through performance and psychological precision. The other nurses used to sit with her. Used to ask her things. Used to laugh at things she said, things that came out of her mouth when her guard was down just enough. But something shifted. Something in the way Sterling looked at her during rounds, the kind of look that says, I see you, and I don't like what I see. A look that says, you don't belong here. The break room door opens. 2 nurses from the med-surg unit, Donna and Keisha, who used to sit with her on Thursdays. They see her. Their eyes pass over her like she's part of the furniture. Donna's laugh cuts through the quiet, a real laugh, the kind that takes up space, and they sit at the opposite end of the room. Laura keeps eating her sandwich. The yogurt is vanilla. Not her favorite, but it's what was on sale. She's gotten good at choosing things based on logistics rather than preference. She's gotten good at a lot of things that don't require being noticed. Her own voice is quiet when she speaks, and she doesn't speak to anyone in particular. She just speaks into the space of the break room, the way someone might speak to themselves. Busy morning. But neither nurse looks at her. Neither one acknowledges the sound of her voice. She finishes the yogurt and throws away the container. The garbage can swallows it without comment. At 7:58 a.m., Laura is back on the unit, back in her faded scrubs, positioning herself at the medication station. She opens the log for room 504, the general Marcus Hayes, post-op day 1, cardiac tamponade risk, on continuous cardiac monitoring, multiple 4 lines, stable vitals at last check. The medication schedule is laid out in a grid that looks like music notation to someone who knows how to read it. Metoprolol. Lisinopril. Aspirin. Furosemide. Each one is a conversation with the body, each one says something different. Laura reads them the way other people read prose. The way a musician reads a score and hears the symphony before the first note plays. The doors at the end of the unit swing open. Dr. Sterling walks through them like he's entering a stage, and the stage is fortunate to have him. He's tall in the way that tall men learn to be, and not just in height but in the space he takes up, the way the air seems to adjust to his presence. His white coat is pristine. His tie is silk, expensive in the kind of quiet way that money is expensive when you have enough of it. He's moving toward the group of residents already gathering around him, and they're moving toward him like compass needles finding north. Laura watches from her station. She watches the way his eyes scan the unit, the way they pass over her without registering, the way her presence is acknowledged the same way the presence of the hand sanitizer is acknowledged, as something useful but not remarkable. He stops at room 506. A resident, a young man named Dr. Coleman, 3rd year, good instincts but nervous around Sterling, is reviewing the chart. Sterling watches for a moment, then speaks. His voice is not loud, but it fills the space like water fills a cup. Dr. Coleman. What's your assessment of the cardiac output on this patient? Coleman swallows. Laura, still at her station, watches the resident's shoulders pull up toward his ears, the telltale sign of someone who thinks they're about to fail. Coleman says something about the ejection fraction, about the echo results, about the medication adjustments he's considering. Laura hears the uncertainty in his voice. She hears the way he ends statements like they're questions. Sterling nods slowly. Not approving. Just marking time. Then he speaks again, and this time there's something in his voice like a knife finding its sheath. That's what instinct gets you, Dr. Coleman. Instinct is what people use when they don't understand protocol. Protocol is what we use here. Do you understand the difference? Coleman nods. Doesn't speak. Sterling smiles, the smile of someone who has just established the hierarchy and found their place at the top of it. He walks on, and the residents follow, and the whole machine continues its rounds, and Laura returns to her medication prep without anyone noticing that she noticed. That she understood exactly what just happened. That she heard in Sterling's voice the particular arrogance of someone who has never had to survive on instinct because his life has never depended on it. The morning stretches forward. 9 a.m. 10 a.m. 11 a.m. General Hayes is sleeping. The monitors are steady. The hospital hums with its normal rhythms, with the sound of wheels rolling down corridors and announcements crackling through intercoms and the constant beep-beep-beep of hearts continuing their work. Laura moves through it all like she was made of the same material as the walls. She doesn't speak unless spoken to. She doesn't make suggestions. She doesn't question the orders that come down from Sterling, even when she feels something in the set of her shoulders that says, "That's not right." She spent 15 years learning not to listen to that feeling. 15 years burying it the way she buried her boots at the bottom of a locker, wrapped in plastic, sealed away from the world. Morning rounds at Oak Creek Memorial moved with the rhythm of ritual, the kind of careful choreography that Sterling had perfected over 17 years of wielding authority like a surgical instrument. Laura pushed the medication cart beside him, her eyes tracking the monitors, the charts, the tiny numbers that told stories doctors often ignored because they were too busy reading the ones they understood. General Marcus Hayes lay in room 504, his face still familiar in a way that made her chest tight, his potassium levels glowing red on the digital readout. 88 millimoles per liter. High. Dangerously high. The kind of number that could trigger arrhythmias, could stop a heart mid-beat, especially in a post-surgical patient whose electrolytes were already dancing on the edge. Sterling was making notes on his tablet, not looking at the patient, just the data that confirmed his decisions were correct. His favorite resident, a third-year named Chen, trailed behind them like a remora fish, agreeing with everything Sterling said before he finished saying it. This was how the hierarchy worked. This was how it had always worked. The general's family occupied the chairs around his bed. His wife held his hand. 2 adult children stood at the foot of the mattress. And there, in marine dress blues so crisp they could cut paper, was the general's brother, a man with the posture of someone who'd spent 40 years taking orders and giving them, whose eyes tracked the room with the kind of attention that told Laura he'd been trained to notice what others missed. Sterling prepared to move to the next room. Protocol dictated the potassium levels would be addressed during evening medication, a standard dosing schedule that worked fine for most patients. But not for this one. Not for someone whose heart had already been cut open, whose electrolytes were already struggling to find equilibrium in a body trying to rebuild itself. Laura's hands moved across the cart. 7 years of civilian nursing had taught her to follow orders. But 15 years before that had taught her something else entirely. The general's EKG strip from an hour ago was clipped to his chart. She'd reviewed it during her early intake. The telemetry pattern was changing. Subtle. Most people wouldn't see it. Most people didn't spend their careers reading the language that bodies spoke when they were failing. Dr. Sterling. Her voice was quiet. Not a question. Not exactly a statement. She kept her eyes on the medication tray, her hand steady, her entire presence compressed into the space between protocol and intuition. His potassium levels are 88 and his EKG shows. Sterling stopped walking. Turned. The entire entourage froze. The moment stretched like a rubber band pulled too far. His face went through a series of micro-expressions, surprise that she'd spoken, irritation that she dared, and then something colder. Calculation. He was about to demonstrate something. He was about to make an example. Miss Bennett. He said her name the way someone says the name of an object. A thing. Not a person. His voice was soft, which made it worse than if he'd shouted. Softness that carried weight. Do you have a medical degree I'm unaware of? Perhaps hidden behind all those years of, what is it now, pushing medications you don't understand. His favorite resident snickered. The sound of it moved through the room like a ripple. Laura kept her eyes on the chart. No, doctor. But his EKG shows peak T waves and his last strip from 0600 showed. Nurses follow orders, they don't give them. Sterling's voice rose just enough to draw the family's attention, just enough to ensure everyone in the hallway could hear. That's why there's a hierarchy. That's why medical school exists. You change bedpans. You take vitals. You follow the medication schedule I've written. He turned back to the chart as if the conversation had ended, as if she'd been dismissed. The potassium supplementation is scheduled for 1800 hours. It will happen then. That's protocol. The general's wife shifted uncomfortably. The brother in dress blues was watching Laura now with an intensity that made her feel like her entire past was suddenly visible, written across her skin in scars he could read. Laura stood at the medication cart. One breath. Then another. She didn't feel the heat rising in her chest because the training was too good, too deep, too embedded in neural pathways that had learned how to survive things Sterling would never understand. She didn't feel the anger because anger was a luxury. She felt something else. Something like the moment before a breach, when your team is stacked at a doorway and you're waiting for the signal that never comes because sometimes the order to move forward gets delayed by bureaucracy and fear. She wiped a single tear from her cheek without breaking eye contact, just one, without looking down, without acknowledging it as anything other than a mechanical response. Her voice when she spoke was steady as a scalpel. Protocol isn't the same as care, doctor. The silence that followed was the kind you could operate in. Nobody moved. Sterling's jaw tightened. His hands gripped the tablet. The resident stared at his shoes. And somewhere in that moment, Laura felt the 15-year facade develop a hairline fracture. That afternoon in the break room, she sat alone with her lunch. For nurses who'd been laughing when she walked in grabbed their bags and left without finishing their conversations. Nobody looked at her. That was worse than if they'd stared. The avoidance was deliberate. Professional. The way you treat someone who just made themselves invisible by speaking out of turn. By the next morning, the formal write-up appeared on the unit board outside Sterling's office. The letters were printed in a crisp sans-serif font that made the words look official, permanent, carved into the architecture of the hospital's hierarchy: Laura Bennett, insubordination and failure to respect chain of command. Below it, a date. A case number. A signature that looked like a snake signature. She stood before that board for one long moment. The hallway was empty. The morning shift was already moving through their rounds. The fluorescent lights hummed their electronic song. She read the words like she was reading them in another language, a language she'd spent 15 years trying to forget, the language of formal documentation and official punishment and chains of command that crushed anything trying to climb above its assigned position. One breath. Another. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way the SEAL trainers had taught her in a classroom that existed before civilian life, before Maya, before anonymity had become a form of survival. Her eye stayed dry. Her hand stayed steady. She turned and walked back to her patients, carrying the weight of that board with her, understanding now that Sterling had just announced to every single person at Oak Creek Memorial that she was expendable, that she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, that her 15-year investment in invisibility had been insufficient camouflage against someone who felt threatened by a simple observation about electrolytes. In the parking lot outside, a nurse she'd trained 2 years ago whispered to another nurse whose name Laura didn't know, "Sterling's got board connections. 3 of them. She's done. She won't last the month." That evening, when Maya came home from school, she found Laura in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee she wouldn't drink. Her daughter took one look at her mother's face and asked why she was so quiet. Laura said she was just tired. The lie came smoothly because she'd been practicing it for 15 years. But her hands shook as she poured the coffee, and the trembling wasn't fear. The trembling was restraint. The trembling was every instinct, every training, every muscle memory screaming at her to do something, to fix this, to show Sterling exactly what insubordination looked like when it was executed by someone who actually had the training to make it stick. She set the mug down and gripped the edge of the table instead. The kitchen smelled like the dinner she hadn't cooked yet, like ordinary life, like the life she'd chosen when she decided that staying alive meant becoming nobody. Through the window, San Diego stretched out in the fading light. Somewhere out there, beyond the careful perimeter of her civilian existence, there were people who still knew her name. There were records in filing cabinets marked classified. There were medals in boxes she'd buried deeper than the boots. She thought about the general's face that morning, the way his eyes had tracked her, the way something in his expression had shifted when she spoke. Recognition, maybe. Or something else. Something like a door opening on a past she'd spent 15 years trying to keep locked. That night, after Maya had gone to bed, Laura walked to her bedroom closet. She moved past the hangers of ordinary clothes, past the shoes arranged in careful rows, past the evidence of her careful construction as a normal person, a person with a normal job, a normal life. At the very bottom, wrapped in plastic, sealed away like something radioactive, were her combat boots. They were old. They were worn. They carried the sand of 3 continents in their treads. They carried memories in their leather. She sat at the kitchen table with them in front of her, the plastic crinkling as she unwrapped them, releasing the smell of gun oil and time and another life. She didn't know what she was going to do with them yet. She just knew that the first crack in her facade had finally appeared, and she was sitting in the dark of her kitchen, staring at the proof that invisibility had never been real. It had just been postponement. It had been a 14-year suspension of a truth that was about to come screaming back through the front doors of Oak Creek Memorial whether she was ready or not. The boots sat on the table between her and the window. Outside, the city hummed its ordinary hum. Inside, something inside Laura Bennett was beginning to wake up. 3 days of graveyard shift. That's what Sterling had arranged for her, midnight to 8 in the morning, the cardiac unit stripped down to skeleton crew, a punishment disguised as a schedule. Laura moved through the fluorescent-lit corridors at 02 for 7 hours with the precise, economical movements of someone who had learned long ago that invisibility required perfect stillness. The monitors beat their steady rhythm in the empty hallway. The ventilators wheezed like sleeping animals. Room after room lay darkened except for the soft glow of vital sign monitors, and in each one, a patient existed in that liminal space between consciousness and dreams, between life and the machines that held them there. She had worked nights before, 12 years in the Navy. She had worked in field hospitals at 0300 hours while mortars fell on Kandahar and the smell of diesel fuel mixed with blood and something else, something darker that had no name. But those nights had been different. Those nights, she had been needed. Those nights, people had called her by her rank, had depended on her hands, had understood that the quiet woman in the trauma bay was the one holding the line. Here at Oak Creek Memorial, here in this modern, climate-controlled temple to protocol and hierarchy, she was simply the woman who had questioned the wrong doctor. The woman who didn't know her place. The combat boots sat in her locker downstairs. She could feel them there, like a weight in her chest. She hadn't opened that locker in 15 years. When she'd pulled them out last night, sitting at her kitchen table with her daughter's eyes on her and no words available, she had felt something shift. Some door that was supposed to stay locked beginning to rattle on its hinges. Laura checked the 4 line on the patient in room 502. Saline dripping steady. Cardiac monitor showing normal sinus rhythm. She made a note in the chart, 2:19 a.m., vital stable, patient sleeping, and moved on. The night stretched ahead of her like an ocean. 5 more hours until her shift ended and she could drive home in the San Diego pre-dawn darkness and sit in her car and try to remember how to be nobody again. That was when the alarm started. Not the soft chime of a monitor alert. The full-volume scream of a code alarm, the kind that made every nerve in her body snap to attention before her brain had even registered what was happening. Room 504. General Marcus Hayes. The monitors erupted into that terrible wailing that meant something fundamental had broken inside a human chest. Laura was moving before she thought. 5 steps. The automatic doors to the ICU wing burst open. The alarm continued its relentless shriek, that sound like a siren that had learned to sing in agony, a sound that belonged to battlefields and trauma bays and moments when the line between life and death became negotiable. Room 504 was chaos in the organized way that hospitals did chaos. Monitors screaming. Alarms overlaying each other in a discordant symphony. General Hayes lay on the bed, his chest rising and falling in that jerky, uncontrolled rhythm that meant his body was fighting for something it couldn't quite grab. His post-surgical site, the cardiac incision from 3 days ago, supposed to be healing, was bleeding. Not oozing. Bleeding. Red soaking through the surgical dressing, pooling against his ribs. Laura was in the room. The door was closing behind her. The residents were in the doorway, 2 of them. She recognized their faces from rotation. They were standing there. Frozen. Waiting for someone with a white coat and authority to arrive and tell them what to do. "Get the crash cart," Laura said. Her voice sounded different in her own ears. Colder. More like the person she used to be. Now. "And Paige Sterling. Tell him we have a post-op bleed, possible cardiac tamponade, code blue in progress." Neither resident moved. They looked at her, this nurse who had been humiliated on the unit board, whose name had been posted under the word insubordination, and their hesitation stretched out like a question. "Now," Laura said. It wasn't a request anymore. It was a command. The kind of command that came from somewhere deep, from years of training, from watching people die when no one moved fast enough. The residents scattered. Laura's hands were already moving. She didn't remember deciding to move them. They simply moved, opening the supply cabinet, finding the needle kit, feeling the muscle memory rise up through her body like something waking from hibernation. A 14-gauge needle. Catheter. The crash cart was rolling through the door, but she didn't wait for it. She didn't need it. She just needed her hands and the knowledge that lived in her body like scar tissue. The pericardiocentesis. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She palpated his ribs, felt the bone beneath the skin, and her fingers found the space where the needle needed to go. General Hayes was still bleeding. His oxygen saturation was dropping. The monitor showed the electrical activity of his heart, but his blood pressure was 80/40 and falling because his heart was drowning in its own fluid, the pericardium filling with blood, compression building with every heartbeat. She didn't think. Thinking was for people who had time. The needle went in at the exact angle. She felt the resistance. Felt the moment when the needle pierced through the pericardial membrane and hit the dark gold of blood that didn't belong there. She advanced the catheter. Pulled the needle out. Connected the syringe. The hiss of air escaping. That sound. That specific sound of pressure releasing. Blood began flowing into the syringe. Dark red. 40 cubic centimeters in the first 3 seconds. 50. The monitors began to respond even before she had finished draining. His blood pressure climbed. 85. 90. 100. His oxygen saturation stopped its freefall and reversed course. The electrical activity on the monitor began to smooth out. The jagged, terrified rhythm of a heart fighting for space began to slow. To stabilize. 102 on the monitor now. Sinus rhythm returning. Steady. Solid. Alive. She pulled the syringe free. The whole procedure had taken 42 seconds. The room fell silent except for the normal beeping of monitors. No alarms. Just the sound of a Marine general breathing shallow but steady, his heart pumping blood through vessels that could carry it because there was room again. Because she had made room. Sterling arrived as she was securing a pressure dressing over the puncture site. He appeared in the doorway like something summoned by the same force that had made her hands move, inevitable and terrible and perfectly timed. He stood there in his white coat with his stethoscope draped around his neck like a medal he had purchased rather than earned, and he looked at the monitors showing normal rhythms, and he looked at Laura's hand steady on the sterile field, and something passed through his eyes that looked like recognition. It was the moment when understanding arrived too late. The moment when he understood that the nurse he had tried to destroy had just saved the life of a Marine general. The moment when his strategic victory began to crack like a dropped mirror. "You performed a medical procedure without physician supervision," Sterling said. His voice was controlled. Everything about him was controlled now, the public cruelty dropping away like a mask no longer needed. He was working with the careful precision of a man executing a plan. "This unit requires protocol. You violated the chain of command in a critical situation." Laura didn't look at him. She was writing notes on the chart. Time of procedure. Amount of fluid drained. Patient response. The administrative details of saving a life. "Step outside, Miss Bennett," Sterling said. Not a question. A command. Just like the one she had given the residents, but weighted differently, designed to land like a blade. She stepped outside. He followed her into the hallway, and the door to room 504 closed behind them like a curtain between two separate worlds. The night shift nurses at the station kept their eyes down. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical prayer. "My office," Sterling said. "Now." The walk to his office took 90 seconds. Each step was a countdown. The hallways were nearly empty at this hour, just the night shift crew, skeleton staff, people who had already learned not to see things that happened in the shadows of the graveyard shift. Sterling's office was on the administrative floor, and when the elevator doors opened, the air changed. It became colder somehow, despite the thermostat being set at exactly 72 degrees. He sat behind his desk like a judge taking his bench. Laura stood. She had done enough sitting in the past 3 days. "That procedure requires direct physician supervision," Sterling said. His voice moved with the precision of someone reading from a script he had already prepared. "You violated hospital protocol. You violated the chain of command. In a critical situation, that kind of maverick behavior creates liability. Creates risk. He would have died without it," Laura said. Her voice was steady. Not defensive. Not angry. Just a statement of fact. "That's not the decision you get to make," Sterling said. He leaned forward. "And frankly, I'm concerned about your psychological stability. This kind of boundary violation, acting outside your scope of practice, disregarding direct physician authority, these are red flags. I'm opening a formal investigation into your credentials, your competency, your fitness for this position." He picked up his phone. His fingers moved with the practiced efficiency of someone making a routine call. "Nancy, this is Dr. Sterling," he said. His voice changed subtly on the phone, more pleasant, more collegial. "I need to escalate a staffing concern. Laura Bennett. Nurse on cardiac unit. I need a full credentials review initiated immediately. Psychological evaluation. Yes, today if possible. I'm concerned about her judgment." He paused, listening. "Yes. Yes, exactly. Thank you." He hung up. He dialed again. "Richard, Sterling here," he said. "I wanted to give you a heads up about something. One of our cardiac nurses, Laura Bennett, she's been displaying increasingly concerning behavior. I'm initiating a formal investigation, and I wanted you to know there may be some liability exposure we need to discuss. No, nothing concrete yet. Just the kind of warning signs we've agreed to track." He smiled while he talked. "I appreciate it. Yes. Thank you." The second call ended. He dialed a third time. This one was shorter. A name. A request. A promise to call back with details. When he hung up, he looked at Laura with an expression of profound satisfaction. "You're suspended pending the outcome of this investigation," Sterling said. "Effective immediately. I'll need your hospital ID and your badge." Laura reached into her pocket. She pulled out the ID badge that had hung around her neck for 15 years. The photo on it showed a woman with careful eyes and a careful smile, someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She placed both on his desk. The plastic badge made a soft clicking sound against the wood. "Saving lives isn't a boundary violation, Doctor," she said. Her voice didn't waver. Her hands didn't shake. The composure held like armor. "It's what we're supposed to do." She turned and walked out of his office before he could respond. She didn't look back. The hallway stretched behind her like a bridge burning in slow motion, and somewhere in the cardiac unit, a Marine general was breathing steadily, his heart pumping blood, alive because she had remembered who she was for exactly 42 seconds. The night was far from over. Dr. Sterling's office smelled of leather chair polish and something else, the particular stench of institutional authority. The walls held his degrees in frames that cost more than Laura's monthly rent, and behind his mahogany desk he stood like a judge about to pronounce sentence. His fingers were steepled. His expression was clinical. He'd called her here 3 hours after she'd saved a man's life, and the moment she closed the door behind her, he began. "That procedure requires physician supervision," Sterling said, his voice steady as a metronome. "You violated protocol. You violated hierarchy. You violated the fundamental structure that keeps this institution functioning." Laura stood in front of his desk, not sitting. He hadn't offered a chair, and her voice emerged without tremor. He was dying. Protocol doesn't save lives. Action does. That's exactly the kind of thinking that gets people killed, Miss Bennett. He walked to his window overlooking the San Diego morning, where the city moved on without knowing what had happened in room 50 for 6 hours ago. "You're a nurse. Not a physician. Not a surgeon. A nurse. Your job is to execute orders, not interpret them." She said nothing. Silence, she'd learned decades ago, was a weapon only the controlled could wield. Sterling turned back, and something in his expression shifted, not from anger to compassion, but from anger to something colder. Tactical. He moved to his desk phone and dialed, his eyes never leaving hers. "Marcus? It's Sterling. I need to move forward with some concerns I've been developing about one of our staff members." "Yes. Today if possible." He hung up. Dialed again. "David, Sterling here. I'm initiating a formal investigation into a staff member's credentials and psychological fitness. Can you join an emergency board meeting in 72 hours? Another call. Another conversation clipped and professional, each one a thread being woven into a noose Laura couldn't yet see the full shape of. When he finished, he looked at her the way a man might look at a stain he was about to remove. "You're suspended pending a formal review of your employment record, your credentials, and your mental fitness for patient care. Your badge is being pulled this morning. You'll receive written notice within the hour." The walk from his office to the security office took 2 minutes. The walk back past the cardiac unit took forever. Laura moved through hallways that had been hers for 15 years and watched them become foreign. A nurse, Jennifer, someone she'd trained in blood draws, turned the corner ahead and immediately looked down at her phone. 3 more staff members stood by the medication cart. They didn't scatter, exactly, but they became focused on tasks that suddenly required their complete attention. The unit board still held her name in the insubordination column, written in Sterling's careful script, and beneath it the notation had been updated, suspended pending investigation. Badge revoked. Security arrived at 9:33 a.m. A young man named Derek, who'd always been kind during her shift changes in the ER, who now wore an expression of acute discomfort as he escorted her from the building. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a wall, a barrier between her and the hospital she'd given almost 2 decades to rebuilding after everything else had been taken away. The ER nurses watched her go. The front desk staff studied their screens. By the time she reached the parking lot, she was invisible in the way that only people who were actively being erased could be, and not overlooked, but deliberately unseen. The house in Pacific Beach was quiet when she arrived, dust motes hanging in the afternoon light that slanted through windows she hadn't cleaned in 3 weeks. Laura sat at the kitchen table in her scrubs, still wearing the clothes she'd worn when her hands had done what they were trained to do. The scrubs smelled of antiseptic and something metallic underneath, the ghost of General Hayes's blood, maybe, or her own adrenaline transmuted into scent. The shaking started small. A tremor in her left hand. Then her right. Then her shoulders. It wasn't fear. 15 years of civilian life hadn't taught her how to be afraid of paperwork and investigations and the casual erasure of her competence. This was something older, the trembling that came from restraint, from holding so tightly to composure that the body itself began to rebel. Her breath came in measured counts. For in. Hold for 4. For out. A technique from a time she'd spent considerable resources trying to forget, now the only thing that might keep her from shattering. The combat boots were in her bedroom closet, shoved behind winter clothing she never needed in San Diego, wrapped in a canvas bag she'd bought at a military surplus store without letting herself think about what that purchase meant. Laura sat on the kitchen tile floor, she'd somehow moved there without remembering, and pulled them down. The leather was creased with the shape of feet that had belonged to someone else entirely, someone who had existed in deserts and mountain passes and the kind of darkness that didn't have a civilian name. The laces were still tied in the way she'd learned, a double knot that wouldn't come undone even if you dragged yourself through fire. Both of which she had done. When her daughter Emma found her 2 hours later, Laura was sitting at the kitchen table with her face in her hands and the boots positioned in front of her like an accusation, like evidence of a crime she'd been trying to solve for 15 years by pretending it never happened. Emma was 17 and perceptive in the way that only children of hiding parents could be. She noticed the silence first, then the uniform, then the boots, and the sequence of those observations created an equation her brain was still trying to solve. Mom. Emma's voice was small. What happened? Laura couldn't answer. Couldn't explain that she'd been fired for saving someone's life, couldn't describe the particular physics of institutional betrayal, couldn't introduce her daughter to the woman sitting at this table because that woman was someone she'd spent every day since Emma's birth trying to prevent her daughter from ever having to know. The boots sat between them like a third person in the room, a witness to every operation, every ambush, every moment in Kandahar when Laura's hands had held a boy's shattered body together while enemy fire decorated the sky above them. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that General Marcus Hayes was breathing steady and regular, his heart pumping blood that would have spilled across a trauma bay floor if protocol had been followed instead of defied. The worst part was that she'd made the right choice and lost everything for it. The worst part was that the moment of having been fully, completely herself, the moment when she'd remembered who she was for 42 seconds while her hands moved without conscious thought, that moment was now being used to dismantle the life she'd built as a substitute for healing. Emma moved closer and sat down across from her without asking permission, the way she did when Laura had nightmares and came downstairs at 3 in the morning, shaking and gasping, unable to explain why her dreams contained things that didn't exist in San Diego. Those are Army boots, Emma said quietly. Or Navy. I don't know enough to tell the difference. Laura's laugh came out as something between a sob and a gasp. Navy, she whispered. Combat medic. Emma reached across the table and took her mother's hand, and in that touch was the weight of every secret, every lie of omission. Every night Laura had listened to her daughter talk about what she wanted to do with her life, never telling her that sometimes the most important things you ever do are the things you never get credit for, the things that disappear into official records and classified files and the kind of memory that belongs to other people, to a Marine general who would remember. The hands that pulled him from fire, to the commanders who saw what she'd done and tried to protect her by letting her disappear. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick cream-colored envelope with a San Diego postmark, official hospital seal embossed in gold. Laura held it for 30 seconds without opening it. Her daughter Emma was already at school. The house was silent except for the refrigerator humming its mechanical rhythm, a sound like something waiting to break. She opened the letter with one finger, tore it clean. Emergency board meeting. Her presence required. Conference room B, 3 days. No explanation. No indication whether this was execution or exoneration. She read it twice, then a third time, searching for subtext that wasn't there. Just words on hospital letterhead. 3 days passed like someone holding her underwater, counting the seconds before her lungs would give out. She arrived at Oak Creek Memorial on a Thursday morning in civilian clothes, jeans, a blue cardigan, the kind of outfit a ghost would wear to its own funeral. No badge hanging from her neck. No lanyard. No credentials. She'd worn that uniform for 15 years and now it felt like someone else's skin. The hallway she'd walked 1,000 times looked different without the weight of her title. Nurses she'd trained glanced up and looked away. One, Martinez, a resident who'd cried in the break room when her daughter was born, turned and walked in the opposite direction. The second-floor corridor smelled like antiseptic and fear, that sharp chemical bite that Laura had stopped noticing years ago but now felt like a slap across the face. Conference Room B was on the 3rd floor, northeast corner, overlooking the city. She'd never been inside it. It was where the real decisions happened, where people like her didn't belong. The door was heavy. Solid oak, probably cost more than her car. What she saw when she opened it made her stop breathing for exactly 3 seconds. The room was full. 8 hospital board members she recognized, men in suits, women in business dresses, the uniform of institutional power. But that wasn't what stopped her. There were 2 Pentagon officials in dress uniforms so pressed and immaculate they looked like they'd been laminated. Navy blues with sleeve boards showing rank insignia she could read from the doorway, OSA-5, senior military rank, command presence radiating off them like heat. And there was a CNN camera crew. An actual camera. A reporter with perfect teeth and perfect makeup standing near the window with a microphone clipped to her jacket. The red light on the camera was on. Recording. Dr. Sterling stood near the head of the table, and when he saw Laura, he smiled. That smile was a mistake. He thought he was winning. He thought the Pentagon officials were here to witness his vindication, his professional destruction of a nurse with delusions of competence. The camera was here to film the moment his authority was validated by the institution itself. He'd practiced this in the mirror. Laura could see it in his posture, the way his chin tilted up just slightly, the way he positioned himself at the center of the room like a conductor about to lead an orchestra to climax. Then the door opened again. General Marcus Hayes walked in wearing his dress uniform, and every single thing in the room changed. The temperature seemed to drop. The air pressure shifted like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. He moved through the space with the kind of certainty that made other people's existence feel negotiable. Decorations covered his chest, medals in rows, each one representing a decision that cost lives. He walked straight to the head of the table, and without speaking, everyone understood that he was now in command of this room. Sterling's smile died. The general looked directly at Laura, and something like recognition, no, something like homecoming, crossed his face. When he spoke, his voice was like a tank idling in a distant garage, steady and enormous and terrifying in its control. That senior Chief Petty Officer Bennett. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain outside, drumming against the windows like applause. Sterling tried to speak. His mouth opened. No words came out. The general reached down and slid a manila folder across the table toward Laura. His movements were precise, economical. He'd done this before, he'd done a lot of things before. The folder was old, edges worn soft from handling. Classified stamps covered the front in faded red ink. When she opened it, Laura saw her own face staring back at her from a photograph taken 20 years ago. Younger face, but the same eyes. The same hands holding the file. The picture was from her military personnel jacket, the one she'd hoped would stay buried in a vault somewhere between Kandahar and eternity. A Navy SEAL commander stepped forward from the corner where he'd been standing silently. Laura recognized him, call sign Breaker. She'd worked with him in 2004, pulled shrapnel from his shoulder while rounds snapped through the air above their heads. He was older now, grayer at the temples, but his presence moved through the room like a blade. He didn't speak to the board members. He spoke to Sterling, and every word landed like a punch. Senior Chief Bennett earned 3 silver stars across 7 combat deployments. Breaker paused. Let that land. 2 bronze stars with valor. Another pause. Sterling's face was draining of color in real time, his professional armor peeling off like paint in a furnace. And a Navy Cross for actions under fire that saved 43 lives. She's the most decorated enlisted medic in her cohort. Most of what she did is still classified. Breaker looked at the camera, then back at Sterling. And you tried to destroy her because she questioned your medication protocol. One of the Pentagon officials, a woman with a captain's insignia and eyes like winter, stepped forward. Her voice was controlled, surgical. Senior Chief Bennett was pulled from witness protection after testifying against an arms trafficking ring that wanted her dead. Her identity was protected for 20 years. She paused, let her gaze sweep across Sterling like a targeting laser. Your background investigation exposed her. Your retaliation against her triggered mandatory relocation protocols. You've just exposed a federal witness and compromised a national security case. The woman smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. Congratulations, Doctor. The hospital board members looked at each other like people who'd just realized they were standing in a building about to collapse. Sterling tried to salvage something. His voice came out strangled, desperate. I was simply following protocol. A nurse performed a procedure outside her scope of. She's a senior chief petty officer in the United States Navy. The captain's voice cut him off like a door slamming. She doesn't have a scope limitation. She has a security clearance higher than yours. And she just saved your patient's life when your protocol would have killed him. She turned to the board chairman. Fire him now, or I'll have his medical license pulled before he leaves this room. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The hospital board chairman, a thin man with the look of someone who'd never made an actual decision in his life, turned to Sterling. Your employment with Oak Creek Memorial is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Your credentials are suspended pending a federal investigation into allegations of abuse of authority and retaliation against protected personnel. Sterling opened his mouth. Closed it. His eyes went to the camera, then away. The red light was still recording. Everything, his humiliation, his collapse, his absolute erasure from the institution that had given him status, was being filmed for broadcast. For the world. Rubber-soled shoes squeaked on the tile floor as hospital security entered. 2 officers, both of them large, both of them professional enough not to look satisfied. They didn't grab Sterling. They didn't need to. They just stood there, present, and that presence was enough. Sterling walked toward the door on his own, and as he passed Laura, he tried to make eye contact, searching for something, mercy, understanding, anything to hold on to. She didn't look at him. She was already looking past him, toward the future that didn't include him. The general's hand was warm on her shoulder. I'm sorry, Phoenix. His voice was low, private, meant only for her. Phoenix. Her call sign. A name only 4 people in the world knew. I wanted to protect you the way you protected me. I wanted to let you stay invisible. Laura looked up at him, and when she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave from the frightened nurse he'd met in the hospital. This was her real voice, the one that had called out orders under fire, that had made decisions that cost lives or saved them, that had survived things that would have broken people built differently. You gave me my rank back, even if I can't wear it. That's enough. The captain approached with papers. Relocation documents. New identity. New city. New life. Everything happening again, all the boxes packed, all the running that was supposed to be over. The captain explained it quickly, the trafficking ring associates who were still out there, the exposure that made staying in San Diego impossible, the federal marshals who were already preparing safe houses. Laura listened without interrupting. This was the cost of being found. This was the price of being seen. That afternoon, she sat in her kitchen with her daughter Emma, and for the first time in 15 years, she told the truth. Not all of it, some things needed to stay classified, needed to stay buried for legal and security reasons, but enough. Why the boots? Why the nightmares? Why sometimes she woke up screaming. Why she'd spent 15 years pretending to be someone she wasn't, someone smaller, someone invisible, someone who'd never held a life in her hands while thunder rolled overhead and the world fell apart. Emma didn't cry. She reached across the table and took her mother's hand, and in that touch was the weight of finally understanding, of seeing her mother not as a victim of the past but as someone who'd survived it. 2 weeks later, they loaded a moving truck outside a quiet house in a new city they wouldn't name to anyone they'd ever known. The worn combat boots went into a storage unit, wrapped carefully, not hidden in shame anymore but stored with respect. Laura started work at a small clinic where nobody knew who she'd been, where her hands moved with the same precision that had saved lives under fire, and now saved lives in a place where the biggest emergency was a teenager with a laceration from a skateboard accident. The nightmares still came. But so did morning. She saved 3 lives that first week, once during a routine check-in when she caught a cardiac arrhythmia nobody else had noticed, twice by making small interventions that prevented what could have become crises. On her desk sat a single photograph from a Pentagon ceremony she barely remembered, General Hayes pinning her Navy cross back onto her civilian jacket, her face numb in the image, his hand on her shoulder heavy with gratitude and regret. A young resident watched her technique one morning, asked where she'd trained. Laura looked at her hands, scarred, steady, competent, and answered honestly. Long time ago. Different life. And that was the truest thing she'd said in 15 years. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you found yourself believing in Laura's redemption, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real strength, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your own story in the comments below. We love hearing from you.